Hello. Yeah, Ahmed, I'll ask you to kindly close your microphone, please. Can you close your audio? Thank you. Hello and welcome to a new episode of a live series, which our Swiss-Italian think tank, Starting Site, has been dedicating to the presentation of the annual report by the Observatory on Radicalization and Counterterrorism based in Italy, also known as REACT. I am sorry for my somewhat raspy voice today. I unfortunately caught a cold, and I hope this does not get in the way of a good comprehension of what I say. I might be sipping some water here and there. In short, REACT is a network whose public and private co-founders and partners who are active across the Swiss-Italian border, study terrorism and radicalization from different perspectives at an academic and operational level. It promotes a multidisciplinary approach to the subject and contributes to a comprehensive and up-to-date understanding of underlying issues. The Observatory was founded in 2019, and last February it produced its third publication charting the latest trends in jihadism and violent extremism, and highlighting some of the work which is being accomplished in terms of countering this phenomenon. REACT 2022 includes 15 contributions by partner institutions and researchers, and also external experts who have been invited to publish their analysis. And we also have 2 case studies that examine de-radicalization, or in a better choice of words, disengagement initiatives within the contexts of Islamist and neo-Nazi ideology involving minors in Italy. You can download the whole report from our website, startingsite.eu, and the report is available in 2 languages, Italian and English. Over the past few weeks, we have been meeting the authors and researchers in order to discuss the content of their papers, and you can find all our streamings online. They are mainly conducted in Italian, however. Today, our guest is Ahmed Ajil. He is a criminologist and researcher at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. He focuses on political and ideological violence. He might say something more about his research and focus later on. Thank you for making time and to be with us today, Ahmed.
Thank you, Chiara, for the invitation. I'm glad to be part of this broadcast tonight.
Ahmed, your article is a summary of a more extensive research on jihadism, in let's say, jihadist terrorist trials in Switzerland. You took some results of this research that you conducted with a colleague of yours, Dr. Castro Clubistani. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And you wrote an article for REACT on 2 decades of terrorism trials in Switzerland. Switzerland is rarely mentioned in comparative research on jihadism in Europe. Do you think this is a shortcoming?
Thank you for the question, Chiara. I do think that Switzerland is sometimes overlooked, be it from academics or practitioners or even journalists sometimes. Although the phenomenon exists in Switzerland, we know that there have been more than 90 travelers into conflict zones since 9/11, which in terms of the ratio or the ratio compared to the population is actually numbers that are similar to Germany and even higher than countries like Italy. So the phenomenon exists. It exists in its different varieties and the manifestations that we might find across the world. But I think the difficulty is, on the one hand, that there is a fragmentation, a linguistic fragmentation in Switzerland between the German-speaking part, the French-speaking part, and the Italian-speaking part, and there is unfortunately little dialogue between these different regions. And it's interesting because the phenomenon itself is actually often has transnational ties. The German-speaking Swiss jihadist offenders often have ties to Germany or Austria, the French-speaking ones to France, and the Italian-speaking ones to Italy. So the phenomenon itself actually has a relevance at the European level because it shows how the different groups and networks operate also into the Swiss context. So definitely, I think it's a shortcoming on different levels, and research, journalism, and academia in general might benefit from looking more closely also at the Swiss case. I wouldn't say it's an exceptional case, not at all, but it helps broaden the picture in some way.
Also, because I'll add, it happens from time to time that links to Switzerland come up in investigations which are conducted abroad. So today we'll try and fill the gap in a way. It's the first step in filling the gap. So as we said, you presented us with a research on 2 decades of terrorism trials in Switzerland. What is the most relevant information that your research tells us about the Swiss context and Swiss convicted terrorists?
So exactly what I did with my colleague Castriot, as you mentioned before, was take all the sentences by the Federal Criminal Court, so the Tribunale Penale Federale in Bellinzona, which is charged with sentencing all cases of terrorism in Switzerland, which are opened by the prosecutor's office, the Federal Prosecutor's Office, and looked at what are the profiles that are convicted, and what are the sentences, and what are also the acts and activities that are tried. What is interesting to see is that there is, and maybe you could show the graph that you just showed to me earlier, which is also in the report, by the way, is that we have anti-terror legislation since before 9/11, but there was one case in 2007 where most of the individuals who were accused were acquitted. It was in relation with the bombing in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. But other than that, anti-terror legislation wasn't really active until 2014, when we had when the new context emerged in line with the Syrian conflict and the emergence of Daesh, etc. Then we see the anti-terror arsenal, the framework, the machine start rolling again. So we see a lot of cases from 2014 on, with actually the majority of cases being tried in 2020, quite recently. It should be known that these cases take a long time to investigate. So if the case is tried in 2020, and we usually looked at the last trial, so maybe there was a trial before, and there was an appeal, and there was a second trial. We usually took the last trial as a date. It could be that the case was actually opened 6 years earlier. That's actually very often the case. So these are long trials, they're costly, but what it shows us is that terrorism is being prosecuted and tried in the Swiss context. The profiles are very similar to the ones that we might find in other contexts. Individuals are often unemployed, very often unemployed. So we see that there is the aspect of biographic availability. So people are not actually involved in a structure that or a sense-making structure that raises the stakes of actually engaging in illicit activity. We also see that there is a significant portion with individuals with migration background, and the majority of offenders are male. Now, what's important to know is that when we look at it through this lens, so through the Federal Criminal Court, through the sentences by the Federal Criminal Court, we are not necessarily seeing the phenomenon as it manifests itself, but we see how the phenomenon is being engaged with through the criminal authorities. So that's just something to be kept in mind when I talk about these numbers. What we also see is that the sentences are sometimes very long, and this will probably, but it really depends. There are different cases, but there are long sentences for terrorism offenses. So it doesn't, the idea that sometimes Switzerland doesn't do anything about terrorism does not hold true if we look at the numbers. And this will also be likely changing in the future, because since last year, the maximum sentence has been raised for terrorist offenses, for different ones, and so we will probably be seeing even harsher sentences from now on for the same offenses. Yeah, so there's a lot to say, I think, but I guess just look at the article, and maybe also the other article that's connected to it, which is a little bit longer, which is in French. But the numbers, actually, I think the general takeaway is that there are activities that are being tried. They're being tried more intensively since 2014, especially since the introduction of the law that prohibits Al-Qaeda and Islamic State in 2015, where we actually saw a widening of the net, in the sense that more activities were prosecuted and tried by the Federal Criminal Court.
Your article is full of details. Of course, we cannot go over the details, the numbers here today, but I invite our audience to go and get hold of it. It's really interesting, and it completes the picture that we have from other countries, similar studies. So it's very interesting to look at it from a comparative view as well. In your last paragraph, you say that most individuals were primarily convicted for supporting jihadist groups rather than for their participation in a terror group. How should we understand this distinction in Swiss law, and what does it imply?
Mm-hmm. So the distinction is actually one that we might find in other contexts as well. Participation means being part of a structure. It's it carries a heavier sentence very often. It means that one has a function in an organization, which is more important. Support is often a form of material support, financial support, and meanwhile also a lot, very often it's propaganda. So maybe supporting the group on Facebook, social media, sharing anashid on what is it called, SoundCloud, for example. Different forms of making the groups, the terrorist groups, visible. That is support, right? And what we are seeing in the context, in the Swiss context, and that's also representative of a general shift, is this shift into the preventive sphere, where we are saying, well, we want to stop terrorism as early as possible. So we have to intervene as early as possible, and not only as police, for other preventive measures, but we're seeing criminal law being also carried into this preventionist logic, right? So a lot of these cases, actually the majority of the cases that we looked at, were tried for support of terrorist offenses, and it's in almost all cases a form of activity on social media or via messaging apps like Facebook or WhatsApp or Telegram. So it's, for the most part, a phenomenon in the Swiss context, at least, that manifests itself in the digital sphere. and which is really focusing on. So if we see if you look at the Swiss anti-terror arsenal, it is really focusing on, in a way, on that preventive sphere and all the activities that fall into that preventive sphere.
And this is, let's say, in line with what's happening in other countries as well, in Europe as a whole. This and the will to anticipate, to act preventative, even more, as early as possible. Okay, thank you for this very interesting insight, especially on the fact that most convictions were for digital activities. That's an interesting data. Over the past 2 to 3 years, there have been some shifts in the profile and motivations of radicalized individuals in Europe. In particular, ideologies tend to be more fluid, while analysts observed an increase in violent actions which are rooted in personal rather than ideological motivations. The Swiss intelligence services, in their 2020 annual report, stated, for example, that the frequency of such acts of violence, which have only a marginal link to jihadist ideology or groups, will remain the same or even increase. Based on other research projects that you carry out and that are related to the motivations of Swiss jihadis, what do you make of this development, of the reality that we just described? What do you think? Do you see the same kind of development or not?
Thank you. You hinted at the other work, and in fact, yes, I conducted. So most of my doctoral thesis was concerned with mobilization of individuals from Switzerland, from Canada, and from Lebanon for conflicts in the Arab world. So the Syrian conflict, the Palestinian conflict, the Iraqi conflict, or even the Yemeni or the Sudani conflict. So why do people engage? Why do they mobilize? Why do they feel that they have a part in what is happening in another part of the world? Right? And actually, the results of this research are being published soon with Routledge. The book should appear in September 2022, just in case you're interested. And if we look at this, it's very what you mentioned, that the fact we're seeing a shift from ideological commitments to personal issues it's a challenging one, right? Because maybe we were misunderstanding ideology earlier. We were over-interpreting ideology in a certain way. We were also, and research has its part in this, overemphasizing the role of ideology, right? And what I'm looking at in my research is, well, how does ideology work exactly? And how does the ideology make the personal somehow relevant for the collective, and the collective relative for the personal, right? Somehow the ideology actually helps individuals identify themselves with a collective, with the collective suffering of other people that they feel that they identify themselves with. So in fact, I think there's a lot still to be said about ideology and to what extent ideology actually plays into this. My research points to the fact that ideology is mostly a narrative. It helps us explain what is happening in the world. There's an interesting theory by Benford and Snow, which looks at the different dialogical function, the diagnostic functions, of narratives. And it says that, well, often it helps us, and ideology helps us say, well, this is an injustice, this is a problem. Something needs to be done about this, and you are somebody to be doing something about this, right? And so we have different functions, and ideology often does that. And the interesting thing is to see how does it work in different contexts. Why does a person identify with something that is happening elsewhere in the world, and what role does ideology play in decrypting the world and problems in the world for that person. So in general, I think the shift might be there because we have a change in geopolitical situation in the Arab world in general. It has become more and more difficult also to mobilize physically for conflict. So we will probably also see, depending on the opportunity structures, right? Now we have the Ukrainian conflict. We will be seeing mobilization for that conflict until the apparatus starts working again to criminalize certain forms of mobilization. So I think we will have to keep an eye on this and see how this develops across the world.
I guess we will be meeting again to discuss these issues because they are extremely interesting and important to discuss, especially at this juncture, 20 years after 9/11 and following the pandemic, and in light of all these developments. So thank you, Ahmed, for this very interesting insight into the Swiss context and your research. Our time for today is up. We invite the audience to keep a track of our work in the Italian or English sections of our website. See you next week for another episode, and don't forget to download the report. Thank you very much to everybody, and have a good evening.